session. Oh, thank you, Cynthia. I just recorded. Um, for those who came in late, too, is remember that next week will be your exam 3 will be on immunity and respiratory system today, and it will be including acid and base, and I will write like 5 questions on acid and base. So some of the events that are happening as part of the respiratory system, the term that you see here is ventilation. Okay, so ventilation is the process by which air moves in and out. We call that ventilation. Okay. External respiration is defined as gases exchange. Okay. Gases exchange between the lungs and the blood. Right? You need the red blood. You need blood to transport the oxygen, and most of that oxygen is tied up in red blood cell. So we call that oxygenated blood. And at the same time, the CO2 that is, the cell is going to use up the glucose and oxygen to break down glucose completely to CO2, right? So there's the transport here, meaning that the blood is going to transport that oxygens and CO2. In other words, blood will transport oxygen as CO2, let's see here. But the blood also transport things like hormones, we saw that, okay, and waste. We're going to talk about that next time. It's called the urinary system. In this case, we call it nitrogenous waste. Okay? Not the stuff that you cannot break down. That's the part of the digestive system. That's the waste there. But in this case, when you break down like protein, you create ammonia. You break down creatinine, you get creatine. You break down uric acid, nucleotide, you get uric acid. All of that we mean by nitrogenous waste. The blood would transport that oxygens and nutrients. Okay, and then when we use the term internal respiration, we refers to gases exchange between the blood and the tissue. And then, of course, cellular respiration is a process by which the cell use oxygen to break down glucose completely to carbon dioxide, right? And so if you look at the event that are occurring, you can say, so let's say here's your right lung, and here's your left lung, 3 lobes, and 3 lobes on the right hand side, 2 on the left. So there's a network of blood vessels. Okay. And so here's the tissue. So tissue have a lot of cells. You can see this, right? So these are cells. Now the cell's going to do is that it's going to take up oxygen and it's going to break that down, the glucose. Okay. If you do it completely, you get CO2, and a lot of that oxygen will be part of water now, H2O, right? And we don't have to balance the equation. Carbon of glucose, carbon in the glucose end up being CO2. Oxygen, a part of that glucose would be part of it is CO2, part of it is also water. But in the tissue, so this is a tissue, and you can see that in the tissue, I was just going to say tissue here. All right. So you can see in the tissue, ultimately CO2 will be increased. Okay, this will be increased in the tissue. So oxygen is going to be decreased because you're going to use all that oxygen up. So oxygen is going to be decreased. So what the blood does is that the blood here is going to bring the oxygen, the oxygen to the tissue, and then is going to take the CO2 away. Okay, so here's a term that you need to know. In the internal respiration, with this right here, gases exchange between the blood and the tissue, right? You can say in the internal respiration, this is what happened. Oxygen unloading and CO2 loading. Okay. So what happened here is this right here, right? Tissue is going to use up the oxygen to break down glucose. CO2 is going to be high, right? Your body get rid of CO2 to respiratory system, and so the CO2 in the internal respiration. That's my question to you. What happened in an internal respiration? CO2 loaded into the blood, oxygen is unloading from the blood, and it gets into the tissue, right? The tissue started up this process, and then so forth. Now, as part of venous circulation now, the venous meaning the blood going back to the heart, right? Going back to the heart, and blood from the right side of the heart goes into the lung, and blood from the lung going back to the left-hand side, right? So once the blood, venous circulation reaches the right side of the heart, right side of the heart brings it to the lungs, and what happened is that it will be now involving external respiration. And in external respiration then is your oxygen loading and CO2 unloading. It's the opposite, right? Yeah. So in the external respiration, you want it to load the oxygen into the blood, and you unload or get rid of the CO2. But in internal respiration, you unload oxygen and you load it with CO2. So then this, right, unloading oxygen or CO2. So this is deoxygenated blood, whereas here, oxygen loaded into this, and CO2 unloading. Now you have fresh blood, so we call this as oxygenated blood. Okay. Okay. So that's sort of like the 5 event. There are a couple ways that you can describe the respiratory system or the respiratory tree. One way that you can identify them is based on anatomy. Okay, so the respiratory system, particularly the respiratory tree, the respiratory tree can be identified. If you identify this as structurally, okay, so anatomically, okay, in terms of in term of anatomical versus physiological. Now, if you want to define it in terms of anatomical term, then we consider these as either the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Okay, that's that's what it is. So upper respiratory tract, say your laryngeal prominent, which is your larynx here. If it's up, that means it's your upper respiratory tract, and that of course including your nasal cavity, the pharynx. You can see here, upper respiratory tract will be nasal. So it'll be here, you say nasal cavity. And sometimes, you speak to your mouth, oral cavity, your pharynx, right? And typically, some people think that the larynx is part of the upper respiratory tract. Some people think the larynx is part of the lower respiratory tract. But we're going to say the larynx is dividing. Right? So we can say, okay, let's say upper above the larynx. So we'll be just here, right? Nasal cavity, pharynx. That's the upper respiratory tract. So in most people who are infected with COVID-19, for example, is in the upper respiratory tract. That means usually in the pharynx. And you can do pharyngeal swab in that area. So basically, you just put the swab and you brush against the wall and remove that and extracted the RNA, reverse transcribed the DNA, and do RT-PCR, reverse transcription PCR, to see if COVID-19 is present. And when you do this, there's a gagging reflex, of course. They're developing a way that you can see when your body's exposed. If your body's exposed, you can develop antibody toward COVID-19. And because the virus hasn't changed that much, so you can have a common antibody to bind to a specific antigen. So then you can look at the whether the person is seroconverted. If they have the antibody to a COVID-19 antigen, then you say they're seroconverted. That means that they exposes to the virus, essential. Okay, so upper respiratory tract, lower respiratory tract, I would say is from the tracheas down. So you need to know the order, right? So what are the order? Larynx, right? Then into trachea. Trachea then goes to trachea. Then primary, I'm going to call primary bronchus. Secondary bronchus. Tertiary bronchus. And then you have division, like, and 20 something division. Then you get what we consider as terminal bronchial, right? Bronchial, and note terminal bronchial first, and then respiratory. Respiratory bronchial. Okay, and then you have your alveolar duct, then and then finally it goes into the alveolus. Okay. And if you have many of them, they're called alveoli. And think of these like cluster of grapes. Okay. And so at the very, very end, you're going to get something like this. Okay, like that. So then we call that alveolus. This is alveolus duct, and then it branches from and so forth. Okay, and what you see here is that blood, like the capillary surrounding this alveolar membrane, like that. And this is a capillary. Of course, this is a pulmonary artery. It's deoxygenated, and then it becomes pulmonary arteriole and so forth. But then in this case right here, this is part of the external respiration in which you get CO2 unloading. Okay. So CO2 is leaving the blood. At the same time, oxygen is loaded into the blood. Okay, like this. But this right here is also very important. Right there. This is known as the respiratory membrane. Okay. And we're going to talk about three components of the respiratory membrane. What are the three components of the respiratory membrane? As you can see that the respiratory membrane would have the three components are here. This is known as the type 1 alveolar cell. There's a basement membrane that sits between the type 1 alveolar cells and the endothelial layer of the blood vessel. So that's really a three component, and we're going to talk about that. And that's very important because knowing the respiratory membrane helps you to associate later on known as the filtration membrane. The lower respiratory tract, as you can see here, and start from here all the way down here, start learning these processes. Different organ, as you can say. So that's one way that you can describe the respiratory tree in anatomical, upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. Another way that you can describe the function, we call this physiological, okay? And this is this physiological known as conduction division versus respiratory division. Now, gaseous exchange can only occur in the respiratory division here. Okay? Gaseous exchange can occur only here. So what is the function of the conduction division? So the functions of the conduction division is basically to provide a exact word is conduit for air to flow. Right. So you know the gaseous exchange is going to occur in the lung, right? So how does air is going to go down to your lung? It has to go through this. Okay. The question is, where does the conduction division ends, and where does the respiratory division begin? Well, as you can see here, nasal cavity to pharynx to larynx to trachea, bronchus, primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, and so forth. See that here is a terminal bronchiole, like number 7 train. The terminus is flushing. That's the end. So terminal bronchiole is the end of the conduction division, right? So make sure you know that, right? Where does the conduction division ends? It ends at the terminal bronchiole. Where does this respiratory divisions begin? Respiratory division is where gases exchange occur. The most of the gases exchange occurs here, so there's no doubt there is this is part of the respiratory division. But really, it's begin at the respiratory bronchiole. Then it goes into the alveolar duct, and it goes to the vilus. So from here to here to here is part of the respiratory division. Okay. And we're going to see next time that to ensure that air can flow in to the alveolus, that you make sure that this tree has to be open all the time, right? So air, if it's collapsed like this, no way air can go through, but you have to have open all the time. And the best way to make it open is that you have to have hard tissue. It can't be muscle. It has to be hard tissue. And that hard tissue made out of chondrocyte, known as cartilage. Right? And so from typically larynx, you start seeing cartilage. And the larynx would be composed of 9 cartilages. You need to know them, right? The epiglottis is singular. The cricoid is singular. The thyroid cartilage is singular. The other 3 that are pairs are the arytenoid, the corniculate, and the cuneiform. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. The trachea has C-shaped cartilage in the anterior. In the back, it has the trachealis. It has a 20 C-shaped cartilage. So to ensure it's open, primary bronchus, you start seeing them. You have 2 primary bronchi, 2 of them, and each going into the lung. And secondary bronchus, you have 5. You have 2. Okay. Each going to go into the lobe, and on the right hand side you have 3 lobes. On the left hand side you have 2 lobes, and tertiary bronchus you have 18 to 20. It starts at 20, but some of them fuse, so you have 18. And each of the tertiary goes into a bronchopulmonary segment. Okay. I'm going to show you that a little bit. Bronchopulmonary segment. And so as the tree is getting smaller and smaller, because it's divide, you lose out the cartilage. And by the time you reach the respiratory bronchiole, there's no more cartilage. No more cartilage. And probably you don't see any cartilage in the terminal bronchiole too. Okay, no cartilage there as well. And so oftentimes when people have an asthmatic attack or a bronchitis, which means that they think it's constricting of the airway so that you can't breathe. Well, not so much in the bronchi, because the cartilage is still, will give it shape, unless the bronchi has mucus in there that's interfere. But oftentimes, if you have a constriction of the airway, that constriction is mostly occur in the bronchioles, because that's only smooth muscle there. And then if it's constriction like this, then it blocks that air can't go through, and the person has difficult time breathing. And then, in the case of asthmatic person, you might take something called inhaler, bronchodilator, for example, which help open it up like this. Things like maybe some steroid or some epinephrine kind of analog that can open up the airway. All right, so here's another way to look at you can divide the respiratory tree into either the upper respiratory tract. You see here, here's the nasal cavity, the pharynx. Right here is the larynx. Right? So from here up is the upper respiratory tract, and from here down is the lower respiratory tract. So that's anatomical division, anatomical description. If you wanted to devise as the function, then it's either conduction division or respiratory division. So make sure you know where does the conduction division end. It's in at the terminal bronchial. Where does the respiratory divisions begin? At the respiratory bronchial. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk more about the nasal cavity and the pharynx, as you can see here. Upper respiratory tract. A couple of things with the upper respiratory tract. Lining these respiratory tract are most likely is going to be pseudo, okay? Pseudo stratify columnar epithelium. Except most of them is pseudostratified, except two areas that you see here, okay? Which is two areas I'm going to show you. The oral pharynx, which is posterior to the oral cavity, and the laryngeal pharynx, which is posterior to the larynx, right here. Here's the larynx, right? So posterior to that, so this right here. Because both of these are it provides a passageway for both. And that's the key word there, right? So these are passageway for both air and food. As such, these two would be stratified epithelium. Will be stratified columnar epithelium. Not pseudostratified, but stratified. So then the larynx on and the larynx on here, they're all pseudostratified. So the way that our body, in certain area to prevent abrasion, right, you want to make many layers of cells. We call that stratified. And in the respiratory tract, the only area that would have stratified epithelium would be oral pharynx and nasal pharynx. As part of the innate immunity, we talk about, part of the lymphatic, we talk about the lymph organ versus lymph tissue. The lymph organs are the one that has the capsules around them, like a thymus or the spleen. In this case, also like the spleen, you can see. In this case, it's also the same thing as a tonsil. And you have three kinds of tonsil. This tonsil here that you see, I'm just going to clear it up. The tonsil that you see here, okay, sits in the palate right here. This is known as palatine tonsil, and you have two of those. So that is pair. You also have this one down here next to the tongue. We call that lingual tonsil. You have two of them. Okay, these two are pairs, right? This one up here, the nasal, the pharyngeal tonsil, you only have one. Okay? So that's the unpair. The pharyngeal tonsil is also known as the adenoid. Okay. So the roof of your mouth, you can see here's the roof of your mouth. We're composed of the hard palate, which is the maxillary, and then posterior to that will be the soft palates, which sits over the palatine. Usually, right here is palatine bone, because it comes to this point, palatine bone. And then, but this would be your mouth is stratified epithelium, and it comes downward to this little dangling thing. This is known as the uvula, okay? The uvula that you see here. And and so in some cases where people have sleep apnea, that mean when they sleep, they're blocking the air passageway, and so they go, they wake up and coughing like this. Um, People have sleep apnea will have difficult breathing when they sleep, right? You don't get enough oxygenated blood, and they wake up choking, and not a lot of restful sleep. You can now they have this CPAP machine, continuous positive ambulatory pressure is a machine that you wear a mask and they push airs in so that you can have nice continuous 5 to 6 hours sleep. You, and I think it just changed people's life. In fact, the CPAP machine, and because if you don't have a restful sleep, you're tired the next day. You can't do a lot of things. With the CPAP, they have a restful sleep. They have more energy. They walk more. They run more, and they lose weight. Right? Sleep apnea often seen in obese individual, and so it's exacerbated. But once you use a CPAP, you have more energy. You lose weight and stuff. So you can use a CPAP. I have sleep apnea. I don't use the CPAP anymore because if you can choose to have a UPP plasty, which means they remove the uvula. So I don't have an uvula now, and they removes the tonsil up here, the pharyngeal tonsil, and the palatine tonsil down here. Okay, so they remove this, and this part of it. I'm okay. So then when you sleep, this area, this is not blocked, so then it can air go out and in during sleep. Notice that in the nasal cavity, um, there is two of these folds called the nasal concave, the superior and middle nasal concave. That is part of the maxillary bone. This one, the inferior nasal concave, is an individual bone. And so then if you look at the 14 facial bone, this is one of, there's two um, inferior nasal concave, for example. But what this does is that it create um, a ridge, if you will, like a mountain range, right? So between the mountain range, superior middle, is a passageway that you see here. This is the meatus. So that when you take air in, it actually, the air that you take in is cold. The air that is stay here is warm. And by creating this nasal concave, you allows this air to mix. So it's like turbulent, if you will, hot air and cold air. It mixes, and the ways to warm up the blood. Warm up the air, right here. But the only way the air can go to the posterior is that it has to go through this, right, meatus. But now, notice now it's nice and straight. And then what happened is that there's a 90-degree bending. You get here and then boom, down. So air can easily travel this way. But if they have particle that you inhale and as part of the air, maybe that particle contains TB or COVID-19 virus, it'll probably just boom, hits against the wall, right? And guess what? The esophageal tonsil has a lot of immune cells that help and fight. So most of the time, a lot of stuff that you take in get trapped up here. Right? And so that's for if you want to be tested to see whether you have COVID-19 or not, they're going to put in a swab, you know, down here like this, and swab your nose, and then take out. Okay. So below this, right here, okay, are a pools of blood that is alternate between the left hand side. Uh, this is known as the venous plexus. Okay, so right about here, I don't know if you see it, is the venous plexus. So basically, if this area is engorged, that means more blood will go in, right? And blood will bring heat, and then heat will escape like this. So then it will warm up the air in this area, and it's alternate between the left hand side and the right hand side, and that's how your air get warm up in here. And so when you take in cold air, creating turbulence, there's a mixture of air here. Of course, sometimes some of the kids, when they're young, they can, they pick on it, on this, and you can rupture that venous plexus that can lead to a bloody nose, hemostasis, for example, a bloody nose, epistasis. Yeah, sometimes high blood pressure can also rupture that, can lead to epistasis, which is indicated here. You can see that erectile tissue here is called venous plexus, and it warms up the air in the nasal cavity. Spontaneous epistasis, known as the nosebleed, and of course, the respiratory tract here will have pseudostratified ciliated, right? It has ciliated. So it's most of these right here will be pseudo stratified ciliated, okay, columnar epithelium. It is considered as part of the mucosal membrane. Okay? So I hope that you guys know that mucosal membrane you will find one of the 5 types of immunoglobulin. Does anybody know what type? That's a review question. Mucosal membrane. Is it IgM, IgG, IgA, IgD? That's supposed to be membrane. Yeah, thanks, Rupa. IgA, very good. Now, the mucosal membrane, meaning that it would have goblet cells. Okay. So along here, sorry, you can't see it. Along here, all this membrane right here, you will have goblet cells. Now, goblet cells secrete mucin, and mucin plus water equal mucus, right? Mucus. That's why I call mucous membrane. So he produces this already, but the cilia help the mucus move, right? And what happens if cilia is not working? You're going to have accumulations of mucus. And this is typically what you see in the winter. It's too cold, then the cilia doesn't move as much, right? And so basically it doesn't work as much movement, and then you're going to have the mucus accumulate. So then you develop, we'll call it nasal drip. Yeah, you just go out there and go, disgusting, this thing is coming out your nose, right? Or for smoker, you enjoy your smoke right now, because over time you're going to destroy that cilia, right? And if you destroy it, you can't move the mucus. You can't move the mucus along. then it's going to be trapped over there. And you're prone to get a lot of infection as well. So go ahead and enjoy your cigarette now. Mhm. Not only that, you're going to get that infections of upper respiratory tract, chronic infection. You're going to get, a lot of obstructive lung disease, emphysema, obstructive lung disease, and you're going to get um, squamous cell carcinoma as well, right? Um, yeah, so enjoy your cigarette. Oh yeah, okay. I don't use cigarette anymore. I vape now. Okay, that's good too. You can vape. Um, okay. Here's a nice goblet cell. You can see goblet cell and cilia. This is part of the upper respiratory tract. You can often see. They look like mini cells. Here's a stratified, but no. All these cells touch the basement membrane. Okay, and they look like mini layers. So we call it pseudostratified. So sinuses are you can find throughout surrounding nasal cavity. Maxillary will have sinuses, frontal, ethmoid, and sphenoid. So these are the four common um, bones around the nasal cavity that would have nice sinuses. The sinuses is one way, one of the functions of the sinuses is to lighten the bone, right? So instead of having solid bone, it's lighter if you have sinus. So that means you have a holes in your bone per se. Here's a nice frontal sinus you can see here. Okay. And you can say, well, the frontal sinus have air here and also acting as a buffer zone, if you will, so that if you have cold air here, right? It usually reaches this area first before it hits into your brain, right? So there's a little bit of buffer in there. But again, either chronic infection or cigarette smoker, that cilia is damaged, bacteria infection, for example, then which then leads to these accumulations of mucus in this sinus, right? Uh, so then you can develop a condition known as sinusitis. And that's when you get fluid accumulations, mucus in these sinuses, and you get headache and stuff like that. It can cause by bacteria infection, sinuses. Um, asthma sometimes can develop sinusitis, as you will. All right. And again, these are the frontal sinus that you can see here, sphenoid sinus, uh, and this is membrane. You can have accumulations in here of the fluids in here. That's your sinusitis. In some cases, you can have non-cancerous growth, but they just come out like this. All right. This is known as polyps developing. And you can just look in through there and see, oh, this non-cancerous growth is a growth, of the mucosal membrane. Sometimes there's a growth that you can see in the lip right here, in the tongue, right? Of that also the membrane, but that is known as a mucocele. Okay. Again, I'll tell you that only the nasopharynx is pseudostratified, while the oropharynx and laryngopharynx were composed of the stratified. Okay. Let's do the last things, which is the larynx, which is composed of the 9 cartilages, and then we're going to take a break. What are the 9 cartilages? That 9 cartilage that are made of the larynx? You need to know that three of them is not pair, and Three of them are paired. Okay. The not paired, the biggest one, not paired is this, the thyroid cartilage, right? The one that is, most of these cartilages, by the way, is made out of hyaline cartilage, glass-like. The only one that is made out of elastic cartilage is this one right here, epiglottis. It sits above the whole, the glottis. So this is the anterior view, this is the posterior view. Here's your epiglottis. Okay. And the one that is inferior, the most inferior, is this one right here called the cricoid. This one right here called the cricoid. So the three unpaired singular are the thyroid cartilage, the biggest. The most inferior is cricoid, and then this one right here called the epiglottis. The pair one that is actually look like the horn. You can't really see it. Look like a horn. So, you know, another way that you can show this is, say, you know, between your thumb, you see here, the middle finger and the pointer finger. So you form kind of like a pyramid. Okay. Up here is your knuckle. And so what happened is that the way that you could do is that if you put the two knuckles right here up here together like this, so there's two case scenario. You can either have the two thumbs together like this, right? Or the two pointed finger can go together like this. So you get either situation like this, right? This. I don't know if that makes sense. You can have the two thumbs together or two pointed finger together. So how does that work? So basically, this knuckle point is the pivot point, right? Pivot point, the turn. And because of this look like a horn, it sits right about here. It sits right about here, okay? That horn. Another word for horn is corn, like a horse with one horn. You call that unicorn. So that would be the corniculate that sits on top, right here, right? And this right here, this one that looks like the pyramid, is the arytenoid. This one right here, cartilage. Okay. And then inside you have these ridge, right? You see this ridge, sort of like web shape. Okay. This web shape of cartilage is known as cuneiform. So, you know, like the land, when I study the Western civilization, they say, oh, it's the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And they were one of the other early people that invented writing. And they use they call it the cuneiform writing, which meaning that it's wedge shaped like. So they just basically press on a tablet and it looks something like that. You know, so that's their writing, for example. So because they have that wedge shape like that, that's what the word form cuneiform means. It's wedge shape. Okay, so why don't we take a 5-minute break? I'm going to stop the recording here.